Anne Boleyn, one of the most talked about women in history. Henry VIII's second wife, married for love and a male heir, executed at the Tower of London. The woman who helped bring about the English Reformation and who changed history forever.
This year marks 500 years since Anne Boleyn's debut at the English court. And for all Anne Boleyn's fame and for all the fact that we think we know everything about her, actually there's a period of her life about which we don't know that much. It's the period before she returned to the English court in 1522. So I've come to the beautiful Hever Castle, her childhood home, to think about who Anne Boleyn was, what made her, what formed her into this character who would change the course of history. How did she become Anne Boleyn?
So what do we know about Anne and her upbringing? She was the daughter of Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn, well-connected and wealthy. Her mother Elizabeth came from the powerful Howard family. Anne had two siblings who grew up with her, Mary and George. Two other Boleyn children died in infancy. It seems likely that Mary was the oldest and Anne was the middle child. But you really have to scrutinise the remaining evidence to piece together the many missing parts of her story.
There's so much we don't know about Anne Boleyn. We don't even know when she was born. Historians have disputed what year it was. We do know for certain, though, that she spent her childhood here at Hever Castle in Kent.
The Boleyn family had been on the rise for several generations, acquiring property all over southern England, including Hever Castle. This was the ideal location for Anne's father to have his country base.
Hever was perfectly positioned for the career of her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, being able to get quickly to London, to the court, and also relatively quickly across the Channel for his diplomatic connections on the continent.
Hever wasn't the grandest castle in Britain, but it was a very comfortable place to grow up. The Boleyns had turned it into a fine country home. And now Hever is staging a special exhibition about Anne's formative years. Even though it's been much changed since she lived here, you can still feel that you're walking in her footsteps and find clues about Anne and her family, including her ambitious and talented father, Thomas.
This is Thomas Boleyn. This is taken from the top of his tomb, which is just outside Hever Castle. And it tells us a lot about who he was. He was a man who had risen to power under Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, because Henry VII chose his courtiers to be men who were not just of noble birth, but who were ambitious, educated, intelligent. They got there by their merit, in other words. And Thomas continued to rise under Henry VIII. He could speak languages, he was a diplomat, he was sent off to negotiate with Margaret of Austria just 3 years after Henry came to the throne. But we know why Henry liked him so much, and it's in this picture. Here we have Thomas decorated with his robes and with his jousting armour, because like Henry VIII, he was completely mad for the tournaments and he was very good at it. And this is pretty much how Henry VIII chose his friends and many of his advisors, people who were spending time with him doing the things he loved. And Thomas Boleyn was one of those people. And we can see that he rose because the robes that he's wearing and this garter here, he was a Knight of the Garter, the highest order of knighthood.
All of Thomas Boleyn's children must have felt quite a burden of expectation. They had a lot to live up to. They certainly inherited their parents' intelligence. I'm meeting Hever Castle's historian Dr. Owen Emerson to discuss the Boleyn children's time here.
Anne's relationship with her siblings was such an important part of her life, wasn't it? And here, of course, we've got Mary, her sister. What do we know about the relationship between the two girls?
I think they shared a lot in common. I think we can say they had a close and meaningful relationship, and they are each other's equals in a way. They like pushing each other's boundaries.
What do we know about the girls' education?
We know that Thomas Boleyn is a humanist. He believes in educating his daughters as well as his sons. And we know that he is a gifted linguist himself. I think he felt very deeply about education, and we know that Anne goes on to be a very keen champion of education as well. But also it's very expedient to have well-educated children that can be placed in multiple different courts and that can have an ear to the ground as to what's going on. Very convenient if you're a diplomat and courtier as Thomas Boleyn is.
And I suppose we can see here that he is educating his daughters in the same way as Catherine of Aragon has educated Mary and had been educated herself. So there's a sense that he's preparing Mary and Anne to enter Catherine's service and be appropriately educated for that.
Absolutely. Elizabeth Boleyn is obviously well educated as well. She is in the train of Catherine of Aragon right from the start. So I think he is thinking of, where their position is going to be. They're most likely going to marry into the nobility, as he and 3 generations of the Boleyns have by this point. And he's really sort of trying to open their horizons as broadly as possible.
One gets the sense that the Boleyn children were very close, but also very brilliant.
I think they are dazzling to a degree. They are incredibly close. I think they're as thick as thieves together. And they really sort of riff off each other in terms of education, in terms of political thought, theology.
Hever was a place where all the Boleyn children were actively encouraged to excel at music, dance and learning. In the castle's collection is an extraordinary book that reveals the sophisticated and learned woman that Anne was to become.
So this is a book of hours that belonged to Anne Boleyn, and it is an incredibly valuable, wonderful thing. So a book of hours was a personal book of prayers, full of prayers to the Virgin Mary that could be said at certain hours of the day, but also it has information in it about how to pray to saints or how to mark festivities, and it's in Latin. And you can see that this is just gorgeously decorated. So this is on vellum, which is calf skin, very, very fine, and it's all been done by hand. So you have to imagine the hours that went into creating this. Look at this gorgeous little angel here in the border, or this strange, fantastical creature. And of course, it shows the Virgin Mary, and here we have Jesus' death. We don't know how it came into Anne Boleyn's possession, but we know it was hers, because we find a page that tells us that this once belonged to Anne Boleyn, because there are maybe 8 inscriptions in this book. Here's one of them, but the earliest was one by Anne herself. And here it is. It says, "Le temps viendra, Anne Boleyn." The time will come, Anne Boleyn. But we need to note the context of this. So we've got here one of the penitential psalms, Psalm 6. It says, "Lord, do not be angry with us forever. When will you return? How long, O Lord?" And on this page, we have Christ doing just that, returning. This is the second coming of Christ. And we've got the resurrection of the dead, these sort of heads popping up out of the ground. And it's under this that Anne has written, "Le temps viendra." The time will come, Anne Boleyn. She signed it. And quite a lot of the time people might talk about this inscription of Anne's, "The time will come," as being something that she's hoping for on earth, that she hopes the time will come when she's queen And we know that maybe she's hoping for that as well. But above all, I think this tells us something else about Anne, because we know that she becomes queen and she marries Henry VIII, and there's been lots of judgment about whether she was being a sort of vixen in acquiring this man. What we forget is that Anne Boleyn is actually a very pious person, somebody for whom her faith was lively and animating, and actually who encouraged Henry in his faith to break from Rome, because in part of what she believed. She believes the time will come when Christ comes again.
At Hever, Anne was brought up to be full of faith, artistic and clever, but her education and experience was about to be accelerated profoundly as her family connections took her away from Kent and into a much wider world.
In 1513, whilst Anne was still a young girl, she was sent away to the court of Margaret of Austria at Mechlin in the Low Countries. Thomas Boleyn's negotiations there as a diplomat the previous year had obviously secured this place for Anne to be a maid of honour at one of the major European courts.
Anne travelled across the Channel into lands controlled by the vast Habsburg Holy Roman Empire. Governing the Netherlands for the Emperor was Margaret of Austria. Margaret was both powerful and inspiring, promoting the education of women and setting up a special library for the female members of her court. Margaret seems to have been immediately delighted with her young guest. She reported to Thomas Boleyn that Anne was so well educated and so pleasant for her young age that I am more beholden to you for having sent her to me than you are to me. Anne set about writing her own letter home to Hever. If you look at it closely, I think it helps settle one of the recurring debates about Anne.
One of the questions about Anne Boleyn is when she was born. And this is a key piece of evidence for deciding that question, because the possible dates are 1501 or 1507. And this is a letter written by Anne to her father from the court at Mechlin, where she had gone to serve Margaret of Austria. And it is clearly not a letter by a 6-year-old. We know that Anne went there in 1513. This is a letter that she wrote when she was probably 12 years old. And the letter is back to her father, and I find it so touching. It's touching because it's written in French, so she's trying to demonstrate to her father that she is doing precisely what he wants. She's learning this language that he prizes so much. But bless her, it is written in really bad French, and it is written with appalling spelling. The 16th century was not an age of very consistent spelling, but Anne is excelling herself here with the eccentricity of her orthography. And it also tells us a bit about the pressures of being Thomas's daughter, because it starts by saying that when she comes to the court, she will be noticed by the Queen. This is Catherine of Aragon, of course. Anne feels the pressure, even as this young girl of 12 years old, to conform to her father's wishes and to please him. She apologises in the middle of the letter for the fact that it's so badly written and that her spelling is so bad. I mean, she knows that she's not doing a great job, but she's trying hard. And at the end, she signs off that she is very humbly, to your grace, your most humble daughter, Anne Boleyn. Anne de Boleyn. Notice there she's added the de, it's very French, and Boleyn, which she's spelt in a very French way. So she is trying here to be the girl that her father wants her to be.
As the young daughter of a powerful and ambitious man, Anne was not the mistress of her own destiny. European power politics soon meant that the young woman was on the move again, as Henry VIII redrew his alliances. In late 1514, she moved from one European superpower to another, from the Holy Roman Empire to France.
This amazing tapestry was produced in France in 1525 at Tournai. And it was commemorating an event that had happened a decade earlier, the marriage of the King of France, Louis XII, to Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. And we know that Anne Boleyn was there. At least she had been moved into the service of Mary, now to be Queen of France, having come from Margaret of Austria. And so I like to think that she could be that young girl just over Mary's shoulder, because Anne was still a teenager. And here she is among Mary's women, all of them here, and among them a young woman. Can you imagine going through adolescence and all of the strain of that, and here being in the midst of this extraordinary occasion and being trusted to be serving this new Queen of France, to be operating there because you can speak French and English, you can be a go-between, that this is a responsibility being given to this young girl. It's a lot on her shoulders, and yet Anne seems to have thrived. But it demonstrated the faith that was put in Anne Boleyn, the trust that this teenage girl could bear the responsibility of now being a lady in waiting to a queen. It shows that Henry VIII trusted Thomas Boleyn's girl to be in that prime position. And I wonder how much the sense of the occasion and the ceremony, the magnificence, impressed itself on Anne. I wonder if it set in her an ambition to be part of something like that one day.
But the marriage didn't last. Within 3 months, King Louis was dead. Mary Tudor returned to England. But Anne Boleyn remained in France. Now she became one of the women attending Queen Claude, wife of the new French king, François I. Her main residence was the beautiful Château de Blois in the Loire Valley. Here at Blois, Anne was close to the heart of another impressive group of powerful, well-educated women who provided challenging and inspiring role models.
So these are 18th century miniatures of Anne and some key players at the French court. So we are seeing these individuals through perhaps a more romantic lens.
Yes, they're quite beautified, aren't they? It's like romantic. They do look quite sort of sentimental. Look at this one of Anne with her little cheeks, little pink lipstick. It's very, very nice. But they tell us about the people with whom Anne was mixing in France. So who do we have here?
So we have King Francis I and Queen Claude, to whom Anne was in service. And we also have the King's sister, Margaret de Angoulême, who I would argue is a very influential figure in Anne's life. And so too was Louise of Savoy, the King's mother.
What influence do you think these two women had? Because it's true that Queen Claude is actually not queen for very long, is she? She dies quite early, and she's quite shy and having children a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So these two women might have been women to whom Anne was exposed in terms of seeing power operated.
Louise of Savoy acts as regent for Francis, so she's seeing a real model of queenship almost in Louise of Savoy. And Marguerite de Angoulême is surrounding herself by rather radical religious thinkers. And I think we can very much see Anne's own strain of ideas about reforming the church germinating here.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Because this is really early in terms of reform. I mean, this is really the beginnings of Protestantism, but Anne is being exposed to these ideas while she's in France. And I think also what you were saying about power with Louise of Savoy being a regent is crucial, because Anne, I suppose, saw two ways of being a woman in power in France. You've got Claude, who is retiring and doing the right thing and producing sons, but then you've got Louise, who obviously has produced a son who's king, but also who's operating with much more of that kind of forthright power. And it's almost as if Anne felt like she could choose between these two models.
And it does seem that Anne took some inspiration from shy Queen Claude. Recent research has found an artistic connection between the two women in a beautiful book that was made for Anne in the 1520s. The work was carried out by Hever's assistant curator, Kate McCaffrey.
Ah, here we go. This is this wonderful book of hours in which you've recently done such important research.
Well, it's a really exciting object that we have in our collection, and I think it can show a lot of direct inspiration, really, that Anne took from her time in France and in the train of Queen Claude. The book itself was printed in Paris in 1527, so we have a direct French link, but also the style of the book, the decoration, is directly reminiscent of books that Anne would have been exposed to at the French court in the service of Claude. So these are the very same borders that feature in Claude's own Book of Hours that Anne would have been around. It's a Renaissance style of border, so you see these kind of classical columns with decoration and the oval borders with inscriptions. And these were very much influenced by Anne's time spent in France and a really nice direct link to her time with Claude and her inspiration that she took from her.
That's fascinating, because that means that your research into the decorative scheme of the book gives us some important information about things that Anne holds dear from her time in France, but also piety.
I absolutely think that Anne was influenced in terms of her religion whilst she was in France. Queen Claude was known for being very pious and conducting a very pious household. She was also around religious figures like Margaret d'Angoulême, who obviously was a kind of real patron for the religious reform that was happening at the time, which we know Anne enjoyed later. She held France dear to her throughout her life. So we know that this book belongs to Anne Boleyn because actually she has signed an inscription within the book, which actually is just here. And it reads, "Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day, Anne Boleyn."
Why has Anne's signature been cut off?
It's been cut there very frustratingly by a later binder. So when the book was rebound, he's cut the pages and he has sliced Anne's signature there, which is very frustrating. It really tells us a lot, I think, about Anne, and also her love of opulent books, beautifully illuminated books that she took from her time in France.
While she was in France, Anne almost certainly attended events where she encountered her father, Thomas, representing Henry VIII. It's tempting to think that she was able to update him on the affairs of the French court from an insider's perspective, particularly at the famous diplomatic spectacular between Henry VIII and Francois I in 1520, known as the Field of Cloth of Gold. We don't know for sure if Anne was there, but Queen Claude definitely was, and it's likely that Anne was in her retinue. But the wheels of diplomacy were turning again. Anglo-French relations worsened, and this may be why Anne, now aged around 21, finally returned to England after over 7 years abroad. France had become wholly familiar to her now, and leaving must have been an enormous wrench. But it was time to enter a different world, the court of Henry VIII and his queen, Catherine of Aragon. Hever has recently identified one of its paintings as being of Henry's Spanish queen.
Ah, so this is beautiful, Kate. And you've recently re-identified this picture for this exhibition.
We have decided to actually rename this beautiful portrait. It was actually bought by Hever in 2004 when it was labelled in good faith as Catherine Parr, so Henry VIII's sixth wife. But we have decided, after research by the National Portrait Gallery into a very similar version of the same portrait, that actually we are going to rename this beautiful woman as Catherine of Aragon, so obviously Henry's first wife. And yes, you see she's beautifully gowned in this cloth of gold. It's very sumptuous red velvet as well. Some historians think that she still is Catherine Parr, but our research comes from the National Portrait Gallery, who worked on the Lambeth portrait, which is a very similar copy of this same portrait. And they actually dated it, so they used dendro technology, X-ray and ultraviolet imaging, and have dated it to 1520. At which point Catherine Parr would have only been 8 years old. So it seems much more likely that this is a portrait of Catherine of Aragon.
So she's got this, lovely hood and this very, very fine clothing, very rich fabrics. And I suppose what we see here is a woman very different from the one we've come to expect. We're told normally by the 1520s she's losing her looks. If this is an accurate image of her, though, this is a much more striking woman, much more like the beautiful Catherine she was than we've been led to believe.
So we think in 1520, Catherine of Aragon would have been around 35. So at this point, she has had her last pregnancy, although she does not yet know that. And I think there's still hope that she will bear a male heir, although that fades quickly after this point. And so, yes, this is really the face that Anne would have seen when she arrived back at the English court 500 years ago.
Of course, it's very dangerous to read character into 16th century portraits. And so we can't really tell the mind of the woman behind this picture. But one thing that is striking to me is this attire and this kind of pose gives such a sense of this powerful, formidable, regal woman that Catherine was and that Anne Boleyn was coming in contact with when she came back to the court in 1522.
Yes, so I completely agree, actually. I think this really very much represents Catherine in her prime, almost. She's secure in her position here as Queen of England. At this point, Catherine favoured the Boleyns, and obviously nobody knew what was to come in the next decade when that friction would occur.
We know for certain that the first record of Anne at the English court is during the joyful festivities before the beginning of Lent, 500 years ago, in March 1522. Fresh from France, Thomas Boleyn's youngest daughter burst theatrically onto the scene.
So here she is.
Here she is, absolutely. This is Anne in the English fashion.
So that tells us, of course, that she has made it back to the English court after all this time. What do we know about her first appearance at the court?
So we know she makes her first appearance at a pageant called the Chateau Vert. It's part of the Shrovetide celebrations for some ambassadors that are visiting. She's playing one of the virtues, and she is playing perseverance. Her sister Mary is also present, playing kindness. And they're essentially held captive in the castle, guarded by vices, and ultimately King Henry VIII will liberate them from the castle.
It's so interesting, isn't it? With the perspective of posterity, we know that the role that Anne played that day would turn out to be so apt.
If only she knew what was going to happen next, and she certainly needed a huge amount of perseverance in the years ahead.
Now, we know that Anne wasn't playing the part of beauty, which is one of the other virtues that they could have chosen.
I think Anne was certainly not defined as a beautiful woman. Even her closest contemporaries referred to her as moderately beautiful. I think she was defined by something else, by her charisma, her wit, her intelligence. And often people talk about Anne's eyes, that she's able to command people's attention and a room.
So if we imagine she's here before us, and here with this amazing clothing that you've got here, this gorgeous dress, would have passed through the court and been just another lady, but be distinguished by her wit.
I think so, yes. I mean, we see her here in the English fashion. This is an English gown. We know from the only contemporary likeness that we can say for sure is Anne, that she wore an English gable hood, as we now call it. We probably more readily associate her because of her posthumous portraiture with the French fashions. But we know that Anne very much wore the English fashions. So yes, this would have been her day wear, her everyday wear.
And so just for those who are thinking, what's the French and English fashion? You're thinking of the French rounded hood, that portrait we all know of her. That's not what she's got on here at all.
Not at all. She's got on what we today would call an English gable hood, but then would have been called a bonnet and a frontlet. And it looks probably more severe than that rather more sleek French fashion, which rather daringly showed a bit of hair. This is probably more conservative. There's sort of a myth that Anne brought the French fashion to the English court, whereas we know it was there for some time beforehand. I think you really get a flavour here of the layers and the quality of the clothing that Anne would have been wearing. It's almost like her battle armour here.
Battle armour is such a good phrase for it, because actually this is beautiful and luxurious and gorgeous, but that's what you need to put on if you're appearing at the court of Henry VIII. You're being in Catherine of Aragon's train, you need to appear of a certain stature and status, and this is it.
This was an extremely expensive gown to create. Only a family of her station and above would be able to afford to wear it. This is not wear for labour, this is a dress for leisure.
Anne Boleyn had arrived. The first ripple in a tide of events that would engulf England and beyond. Nothing would be the same. Her extraordinary personality would place Anne at the very heart of history.
So by 1522, when Anne came to the English court 500 years ago, who was she? Well, she was a woman of sophistication. She had been brought up here with an education that was finer than almost any other woman of the time. She had gone to these European courts where she had become cosmopolitan and glamorous and sophisticated. She was someone who had become dazzling, someone who could attract the attention of the highest in the land.